The following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of The Press Room from the AZPM radio studios. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. Coming up with this particular program, we'll discuss the latest with Pima County Sheriff Nanos. We'll also have more visits to Arizona by members of the presidential tickets. But first, let me introduce to you our distinguished panel of guests, Jim Nintzel of the Tucson Sentinel, Yana Kunichoff of AZ Luminaria, Tony Perkins of AZPM, and Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel. Thank you all for being here. Jim, let me start with you. Pima County Recorder's Office, a couple of weeks ago, had an online setup that was allowing voters to request an early ballot. Makes a lot of sense for folks. But about a week before the deadline to make their request, the Recorder's Office made that portal unavailable. I'm going to make an understatement. That seems like a controversial decision, but they clearly had good reasons to do it. You reported extensively on that. Why did they do that?
Well, it almost became like an I Love Lucy episode. They were getting so many requests rolling in through that portal that on the Saturday they chose to shut it down. They discovered that they had about 6,000 requests in the queue, and they just felt like they were going to keep getting so many more that they could not possibly handle it. So they decided, we're going to shut it off. We're going to take these 6,000 requests. They sorted through it. They determined about a fourth of them were, or a third of them were duplicate requests. And then they sent an email to the other 4,000 people saying, call our office instead, which then led to a deluge of phone calls coming through to the office on the week following. I think one of the reasons they ended up with so many duplicate requests was they accidentally, or not accidentally, but there was a delay in sending out the ballots. And usually in Pima County, you get your ballot a couple days after early voting starts, and this had dragged out through the course of a week of mailing them, and that slowed down people receiving their ballots, and as a result of that, people started saying, hey, I haven't gotten my ballot, I'll go online and order it.
Before the rest of the panel weighs in on this, you mentioned phone calls, and one of the most interesting parts of your piece, I thought, was former state lawmaker Ted Downing, who did not mince words when he spoke at the Recorder's Office. What were some of his biggest concerns?
Well, he was concerned that you're suppressing the vote. I mean, he's saying, look, if you're getting so many requests, you should be fulfilling those requests, not telling people they can't request ballots anymore. People want to get their early ballots. They want to vote, and you're putting a barrier in their way. So he felt like it was a voter suppression thing, and also that it would lead to complaints from Republicans, as he put it, that there was shenanigans going on. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now in the wake of all this.
Yeah, Tony, there's a genuine concern. There are folks out there who are saying whether this was done on purpose or not, this gives another narrative to folks who are concerned about the election.
Right. There are enough people, especially during this election, who are asking, will my vote count? And here you have a situation where there are more and more barriers that are put up in front of you, and you're not even getting to that point where you're asking yourself on election day itself, after you've cast your ballot and you're waiting for the returns, well, is what I said and what I decided something that's going to be entered into the record?
Yeah, Paul, is there a feeling that the Recorder's Office has done a good job to this point? This is a presidential election with this particular administration. Were there concerns that this office wouldn't be able to handle this in some sense?
Well, I mean, it's the sense is that, I mean, there's a lot of avenues for people to get votes. There's a lot of ways for people to get their votes. Of course, there's early ballots. If you're part of the early balloting list, you should have gotten your ballot. You should be able to return it. You probably should have put it in the mail this week, maybe yesterday, really. And so there's just different ways, but there's also, there's very clearly some confusion about how people can vote. I think in some ways, there's so many avenues to vote that people are getting a little bit confused about how they should do it. You can do early voting, you can send your ballot back, and you also can do emergency voting. And then, of course, on Tuesday, you can go and just vote in person. So there's still those avenues to it.
People still do that?
Oh, I assume so. I don't know. I do my early ballot because I always have to work on election day.
Yeah. I think one thing we should also point out while we're talking about early ballots is that they are the main reason we have such delayed results in Arizona. Folks turning them in at the last minute, those ballots then have to go through the signature verification process to make sure it was the actual voter who cast the ballot, and that will take days after the election to actually sort through that. Long time here, probably even longer in Maricopa County, where they're going to have even more people turning in their ballots at the last minute. So we're going to have election overtime, just as we always do in Arizona. We're not going to know results of close races on election night, and we should be warning the public that that's going to be the case.
Yeah. Yana, what stands out to you about this recorder story?
I think just the sense that folks have mistrust and questions about the election process, and that I think anywhere that public officials, but also the media, can just like really clearly explain what this process is, what it can look like, and what people expect. Like, I think the note that we're not going to, especially in close races, know who the winner is on election day, I think is really, really important.
Since I have 4 excellent journalists here, Jim, I'm going to start with you, though, because since you did the reporting on this, but I want to have all of you weigh in on this a little bit. Deputy recorder in the Pima County Recorder's Office said, didn't bring this up, didn't think it would be a story.
Yeah, and I think that was a mistake on their part. I think transparency is so important in the election process, and they probably should have sent out a press release. We are not going to be able to take care of your ballots, your ballot requests online. Please call our office. Send it out. Let the TV stations and the newspapers and the online sites know that this is going on, so that we can spread that message out rather than try to hide it. And then, my first few questions to them, I got back very generic answers until I started looking into it, asking a few more questions, and then finally I got a phone call to explain what happened.
Yeah, Tony, there are no questions of malfeasance, at least not from people who are reputable at this point. But yes, it does. The perception of this is, why wouldn't you guys think this is a story?
Right. I mean, it's so many things. There's expectations and there's reality. And the reality is that it's a process that's sort of messy, actually.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get the results immediately. And that's the expectation.
Absolutely, always. But it doesn't happen that way here.
Well, no, and one thing I think that's really tough is to understand how complicated the voting system is, how many sort of moving parts there are. And, because, you see ballots, you have a ballot that comes in, it has to go through signature verification, it has to go through, and there's sometimes people make mistakes. I remember the recorder's office showing how, like, couples would have, they'd have a ballot and they'd accidentally switch their envelopes. Yeah. And of course that means that they get one they can't really authorize because it's got the wrong signature, so it's the wrong ballot in the wrong envelope. They have to wait till the other one shows up, and then they kind of have to call and communicate with people. That process takes time because of course people don't answer their phones because it's a random number that maybe they don't know. They don't answer the phone right away. They don't answer their email. It takes time. So these little processes always add up. The recorder's office, I think Jim's right. They made a mistake in this. They wanted to do something. They wanted to sort of fix the problem, but I think they sort of forget that they really have to explain themselves all the time. And that's probably a tough place to be because you're trying to kind of fix the problem so you can move on, so you can process these thousands and thousands of votes that are coming in so that you can be ready on election day. But I think they made a mistake of saying this isn't a story. Yeah, no, it's a story. And I think it's an important story of saying you guys have to show how you're doing these things and how you're moving this process through.
Yeah, Yana, they're trying to juggle a lot of balls at once, but the public wants to know and needs to know, especially these days of conspiracy theories.
I would just, I think especially when I'm writing a story, I don't assume any level of knowledge that someone is coming to a topic or a system with. Okay. My colleague did a story a couple of months ago where the recorder's office tried to walk people through, like, what happens to a ballot after you turn it in and what does that look like? And I wonder, like, all the places that information can live, I think would make everyone kind of a more informed public.
Jim, my last thing on this has to do with a budget, frankly, and I don't know what the recorder's office budget is, but it seems as though they simply did not have enough people to do this. Is there a remedy to the situation? If they had a higher budget, could they have hired more people who might have helped this and avoided shutting down the portal?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. I know I spoke with the former Pima County Recorder, F. Ann Rodriguez, and she said, look, when we were in this situation, we would move staff around, and that would we'd assign additional staff to handle this kind of thing if that was the situation.
Okay. Yana, let's move on to a story that both you and Paul covered this week. The latest on Sheriff Chris Nanos. One of the 2 staffers suspended by Sheriff Nanos was in court earlier this week, asserting that his First Amendment rights were being violated. So let's go over this first. So why was that staffer, Sergeant Aaron Cross, asserting that his First Amendment rights were being violated?
Yeah, so Sergeant Aaron Cross, who is employed by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, but has been kind of vocally opposed to the re-election of incumbent Sheriff Chris Nanos, has been protesting and saying deputies don't want Nanos. And the Sheriff's Department alleged that what he was wearing made it seem like he was an on-duty deputy. So we kind of entered this place where the conversation's happening in federal court, in a court case where we're trying to sort of parse what Mr. Cross can wear when he's protesting. So I hear, you know, when I was writing this story, I was like trying to kind of understand. The judge asked the Sheriff's Department to reissue a statement on like what is okay to wear while a deputy is off duty and protesting. So, and I don't know if I can answer that many other questions after this about this specific detail, but you can wear a polo shirt, but you cannot wear it with green or khaki combat pants and a tactical belt. And you cannot wear combat pants, a tactical belt, handcuffs, and tan boots together. So I think there's like a fair amount of nuance here to sort of decipher.
Paul, with all the things with Sheriff Nanos, did you think you'd be covering the off-duty clothing policy?
This is my like favorite little extra thing that's happened in this campaign. You know, I mean, one thing it's very clear. This has been a long-running campaign. You know, the Cross has been somebody who has really been against Nanos. He created an organization, the Pima County Deputies Organization, that really is opposed to Nanos. And for the last almost 18 months, I want to say, he's really pushed against Nanos. And over time, that's also mean that he's kind of gone for the candidacy of Heather Lappin. Heather Lappin is a lieutenant. She actually is the commander currently of the jail. And so she's both. So you really have this situation where you have two people who are working for Nanos, who are opposed to him, who are vocally opposed to him, and, you know, now are facing administrative leave, you know, because of their actions, because of the things that Deputy Cross did, but also some of the things that Lappin did as well. You know, there's really an accusation that Heather Lappin actually knew what Aaron Cross was going to do, and then he put her in administrative leave, and then he also accused her of colluding with a journalist, essentially Heather Lappin actually helped one of the journalists pay for a phone call that this person in the jail actually did. So it was a way of reimbursing this inmate who was interviewing with John Washington, one of the Arizona Luminaria reporters. So there's a couple of things, but we'll focus on the uniforms thing for more. So the central issue is, what are you allowed to wear if you're protesting? And, you know, one of the things that the attorney for the Sheriff's Department said is essentially it's about the totality of what people are wearing. So it's not just one item, but it's the whole thing. And so it's not about wearing the tactical pants, it's about wearing the belt. It's also wearing sidearm, the right boots, and also kind of the tricky thing, I think, in part of what uniforms really look like now. I think if we looked in 20, 30, 40 years ago, a police uniform was kind of a really clearly identifiable thing. But police have moved towards kind of more of a tactical look, more of a kind of clothing that's more of what military use. There's kind of, I think, a mix of clothing. And also a lot of people who are detectives, who are working other kinds of jobs inside of departments like the Sheriff's Department, tend to wear kind of the same stuff. Yeah. You really see the same kind of tactical pants, tactical boots. But the real issue is, what are you allowed to wear while you're protesting the sheriff? And that was the central issue.
We know.
Well, no. I think it's still kind of fuzzy when it comes down to it. You know, one thing that during the hearing on Monday, that Judge Collins asked for afterwards is he really wanted a kind of write-up of what people were allowed to do. And the Sheriff's Department said, well, this, but not this, but this, but this, but not this. And so there's still kind of a fuzziness about what do you want to wear. And I think so, you know, if somebody wants to go and protest the sheriff, maybe they should, you know, wear other kinds of clothing.
Yeah. Tony, weigh in on this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I tend to look at it the way that voters see this issue. And they read about it, they hear about it, and that kind of thing. And just the timing, it was just incredible. With this late date before Election Day, there's a limited amount of space for Nanos to sort of recover from this. Mm-hmm. The lasting impression that people get is that, you know, hey, he's put his opponent on administrative leave. Mm-hmm. You know, in one sentence. This is the impression that they have when they're writing their mail-in ballot or they're going to the polls on Tuesday. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out, of course, but it's something that you know, timing-wise, couldn't have been worse, or for Heather Lappin, I guess, couldn't have been better.
Well, and Jim, you moderated that initial debate, maybe the only debate between Nanos and Lappin months ago. obviously there was a lot of tension there, but they also had a lot of areas of agreement as far as policy. So now we're looking, I think maybe surprisingly so for some folks, but now we're looking at this, about 2 months later. What's your assessment based on what you saw 2 months ago?
Well, I think Tony hit it on the head in that this is a race where Chris Nanos is the incumbent, and he has a tremendous voter registration advantage in Pima County. And I think all he did with this was really fuel his opponent's campaign. If he loses, and I think he's still the odds-on favorite to win, but if he loses, he can really blame himself in this decision.
Well, and Paul, I've wondered about this too. All of these folks, this is an elected office. All these people have political consultants. Not to say political consultants are always right. They're often not. But wouldn't you think one would say, listen, maybe even just from a perception standpoint, as Tony said, voters are going to see this and say, wait a second, this is someone who's running against you and you're suspending her? That doesn't look good.
I mean, one thing that's, I think, clear is that Nanos is his own man. He does what he wants to do, and he does what he thinks is the right thing to do. He's defended his decisions in saying, hey, this is something that we have to do by policy. We're required to. We had complaints from citizens who said these guys were dressed as sheriff's deputies. They were violating law. He argued they are violating the Hatch Act, which actually could make the sheriff's department subject to a federal lawsuit as well and actually losing funding. And this has been his central argument. It does weigh into the thing, though, but that he's been accused of being retaliatory. I mean, one thing that Aaron Cross told me 2 weeks earlier was that, Nanos regularly bullies people in the office. He retaliates against people that he doesn't like. And, I have to say, I mean, this really does lean heavily into that idea that if you do something that bothers him, he's going to put you on administrative leave. He's going to put some investigation against you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to be an informed voter in this race, people just have to pay a lot of attention, because I think there is the personality politics part of it. I think there is the accusations against Sheriff Nanos for being retaliatory. I think this has definitely put the spotlight on Heather Lappin as someone who is kind of like subject to that action. At the same time, I was looking at some of their policies earlier this morning, like on Prop 314, which would allow state and local police to arrest and jail migrants. Both of them are against that measure. Heather Lappin has run on more sort of a good government and transparency ticket compared to how she says Sheriff Nanos has run the jail. But I think that some of this has really taken away from like some of the policies of like, what do we want the sheriff's department policy to look like around the jail and policing more broadly in Pima County.
I'm going to ask all of you about this. Tony, let me start with you. We know this is going to be a massive ballot. I've already filled mine out. In Maricopa County, it was 4 pages. Obviously, this is a very important position. But when you look at how many other races people are voting on, could this, even with this latest controversy, could it just get lost in the shuffle for a lot of voters because they're voting on so many other things?
And when you look at your ballot, you'll see the 2 names there, or in other cases, a multiple number of names. And for a lot of voters who are low information voters, their mind will go back to the sign that they saw on the side of the road, and they'll may notice maybe they want to look a little bit more into that particular race. But for the most part, they're looking at names, and is this name familiar? Is this name familiar? And for what?
Good.
Why is Nanos' name familiar? And it's not a positive thing in his case.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jim.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a lot of people running. There are limited numbers of news stories about them out there, but Nanos managed to put himself right in the middle of the spotlight with this decision. Yeah. And especially the one about the journalist and John Washington over at the Luminaria, who's, the suggestion that he was doing something unethical by reimbursing an inmate to be able to have a communication with him, I think was something that is troubling.
Yeah. Yana, what about the size of the ballot? Will that somehow help Nanos in any way?
I think that it is, I don't know if it will. I think that this has been a race that anytime I have mentioned it to people, they have known what is going on. Okay. So I think that this will probably stand out compared to like a long list of judges. But I do think that as a voter, I had to do some extra legwork to learn about every race on the ballot. And I think that it is challenging and it asks a lot of voters to be fully informed.
Mm-hmm. Paul, final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you come down to it, yeah, you're right. I mean, we haven't talked about the supervisors. I mean, there's 2 supervisor races. There's other races happening. We haven't talked about the constables. They've managed to really skate under the radar. There's lots of other things happening, but yeah, I mean, there's certain races that just have absorbed everyone's attention. I mean, of course, there's the 2 big national races, but even Congress, some of the congressional races have maybe kind of floated under people's radar a little bit, but this one, I think in Pima County, the sheriff's race has become really important. I think it's been important for a while because of problems at the jail, and I think that the last couple of weeks have really nailed this down in people's minds about where they're going to vote.
Jim, let's move on to some other voters. Secretary of State Adrian Fontes said in Maricopa County Superior Court this week that he didn't, quote, want blood on his hands by having to release the names of tens of thousands of voters who hadn't proven their citizenship. But now a judge has ruled he'll have to release 98,000 names. Obviously, the office might appeal this. What do you make of how this turned out? The fact that we could be looking at more than 200,000 voters who didn't properly say that they were citizens, which happened in the late 90s, and now we're feeling the effects of it. What does this say? What does this ruling potentially do? Could it mean anything ultimately?
Well, I imagine what it does is put the names of voters whose status is in question, although the Arizona Supreme Court has said these people are eligible to vote. There may be a lawsuit down the line, depending on how close the races are. People want to say, oh, this person shouldn't have been able to vote. Unfortunately, once someone's voted, you really can't go back and find out which ballot they voted. But I think, again, it just lends itself to the whole election conspiracy stuff that's out there. And one certainly hopes that it's not going to lead to some kind of intimidation of these voters as a result of their names being released.
Tony, back to perception of these things. A ruling like this might make people think, oh my gosh, there are all these non-citizens who are voting, when in fact we just don't even know yet.
Right. It's almost a case of looking for a reason to doubt the process, and here is that reason. It's out in front of people, and this is going to be a story that's going to have legs for days and weeks, maybe for a few months after the election is over.
And Paul, one thing that stood out to me is that the number of people who are supposed to see who these names are is supposed to be very limited. Mm-hmm. If that is in fact the case and people don't put them on Twitter or X, then maybe it won't have as big an impact. But again, I would come back to perception. That's my favorite word today, apparently.
Well, and one thing too, I think it's important to say these are not people who are non-citizens. These are people who exist in kind of a loophole where they didn't have to prove their citizenship when they first registered to vote, and then they had just never proved it to the DMV. They've never submitted anything, but they're probably citizens. They're most likely citizens. They're probably all citizens. I mean, really, they're all citizens. They just haven't filled out a piece of paperwork.
Well, this was at a time in the late 90s when people were not worried about this in quite the same way.
Exactly. And so, the perception, one thing they really keep in mind is that and I think Fontes makes a good point, people who have been in recorder's office have gotten death threats, people who have been involved in voting, who have been involved in early voting, volunteers have faced death threats, and this has happened not just in Arizona, this has happened all across the nation. So a release that shows 80,000 people who theoretically, shouldn't have been able to vote, and letting that list be public, I think, it's a really bad idea. They're ultimately, people are going to go, and they may not even find the right person. They may find somebody with the same name and go, hey, you shouldn't have been allowed to vote, and I have a real problem with that. That's I think, really going to be a problem for a lot of people. And I think Tony makes a great point. This is kind of the excuse. I think you said months, I think years, about how this goes. There's been, we see this with the 2020 election. We see this with the 2022 election. We're still seeing legal fights for both those elections about what the results are. And certainly, I think we're going to see this driven the same way, and that we see lawsuits over these people who are vote, especially by the people who lose in this election.
Yeah, and how dramatic and how long could this potentially be?
I imagine that there will be many threads from this election that go on for a very long time. And I think that this just makes me think, again, like we are working in some really complicated systems. Like, as I understand it, it is a 2004 law or ruling that requires citizenship to vote, proof of citizenship to vote in Arizona, but those same documents are not required to vote in federal races. So like there's multiple systems at work here, that not necessarily in like a nefarious way, but I think when people don't understand systems, then I think they are more likely to feel that those are unfair or to have mistrust of them.
Yeah. Tony, our last couple of minutes, I promise not to make anyone make predictions they don't want to make, but what Arizona race are you watching most closely as we approach Election Day? What is the one that you think is most fascinating, or if a person won that it was a surprise, you'd be most interested in digging your teeth into?
Well, one thing I've noticed during this season is Rex Scott versus Steve Spain.
Okay.
A lot of money has been spent, and the ads you see are all anti-Rex Scott. I saw the signs and everything, and read all the material about Rex Scott. I didn't know who he was running against. Okay. I think Steve Spain should have gotten his name out there more prominently, and again, we'll see on Tuesday just exactly how that race is going to wind up, but we'll see whether or not Rex Scott is as bad as Steve Spain said he was.
Yana, when you're covering the sheriff's race, any other race in the county, the state you're most interested in?
I think that looking at the TUSD, the Tucson Unified School District Governing Board, I think is important. I think that in Maricopa County, a lot of governing boards have become sites of a lot of divisiveness, and I think kind of like sort of political stages for like bigger topics. And I think that watching what happens with TUSD and that there are candidates who are just speaking to the issues that I hear from students feels really important.
I love that these first two are very local. Paul, what about you?
I mean, I think one of the most fascinating races is going to be the one for CD6, the one for Juan Ciscomani versus Kirsten Engel. I mean, this is the second time around for both of them. They've gone through. Ciscomani is a freshman Republican. He's really framed himself as being kind of a bipartisan Republican who works across the aisle. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not other issues, especially abortion, really becomes the issue that maybe actually ends up keeping him from being a sophomore and going back to Congress. So I think that race is really, really fascinating because it shows sort of the messiness of Arizona politics. That's a district that has always gone back and forth. Back in the day, it was Gabby Gifford's district, and now it's a Republican one. Great. We're going to see if that holds or not.
Jim, about 20 seconds.
Oh boy, LG 17, Legislative District 17. The Democrats are making a real run to try to flip the legislature. This is a Republican district, but they have spent a ton of money trying to oust at least one House member and the Republican senator there. A couple others in Pima County will also help decide that balance of power.
Okay. Thank you all to the panel. Jim Nintzel of the Tucson Sentinel, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, Tony Perkins of AZPM, Yana Kunichoff of AZ Luminaria. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Steve Goldstein. Thank you very much for joining us in the press room as well.